thanks for joining us. Welcome to another KAPcast, and I'm here with Graham Park from Shooters Union. Graham, I'll give you a quick overview. You're the president of Shooters Union Australia, and long known to myself and many others. You're a qualified firearms instructor and a dozen of advanced international civilian law enforcement training programs. You're married with 4 daughters and residing in property there at Warwick, rural property at Warwick. And telling me about your big camel investment there years ago. We'll get to that later. And you're the media spokesperson, which you well know, for Peak Lobby Group Ag Force on firearms issues, and a long-time member of the Queensland Police Firearm Advisory Panel. And you've seen six different police ministers on both sides of politics that time. So a lot of time in the saddle and a lot of time to answer all the curly questions on firearms. And we've always been very strong on defending the rights of licensed firearm owners in KAP. So thought it was natural that we brought you in to have a chat, and I'll ask you a few curly ones and try and trip you up and test you out, and just give, I guess, I mean, it's always about trying to educate people on both sides of the argument, because I think certainly mainstream media just hovers on the easy stuff and the basic arguments like guns kill people, but I'd personally argue that we're on the one of the most prejudiced like organised groups in society, modern society. They're just ostracised in so many ways. But, yeah. Did I cover everything there in your bio, Graham?
Yeah, that's good. Listen, thanks very much for having me on, Robbie. It's wonderful to be on with you and the KAP today. Fantastic. Thank you.
And pretty big deal, Shooters Union. How many members would you have out there?
I'm not sure nationally at the moment. I know it's been growing dramatically.
Well, tell me how many licensed firearm owners there are.
Somewhere over 25,000.
And tell me how many licensed firearm owners would there be in Queensland, roughly?
There's approximately 200,000 licensed firearm owners in Queensland. And when you add in people who also can use firearms without a license, which would include police officers and also include family members of licensed firearm owners on properties and things like that, there's probably about 300,000 legal users of firearms, at least 250,000 in Queensland.
That's a big number.
Yes.
And I mean,
it's a big number of people when you consider that the mainstream parties on both sides have chosen to ignore 250,000 adults' interests and what they do. And would that happen with any other group? You said before about discriminated against. I would say that's entirely true. Demonized, discriminated, everything else. It just would not happen with other groups.
Yep.
And I think people in regional Queensland especially are sort of a bit more aware of this, because regional Queensland tends to be ignored.
Yep.
Well, as shooters, we tend to be not just ignored, but actually picked upon at times. We're a good scapegoat.
Yeah, I mean, that's how it, and that's the one thing I certainly understand from my point of view is the optics in politics is everything, and the substance is taking more and more of a back seat where you can't even see it in the back anymore. It seems immaterial, really. It's all about the optics, and and there's that growing perception around firearms that just people seem to accept without questioning any of the evidence or the lack thereof evidence, then go along with it. It's funny, and when you're talking about 200,000 people, it's or 250,000 people, if you like, up there. If that's that big a number, when I went to get my weapons license, my firearms license, I don't know, 15 years ago maybe it was, the hoops I had to, and when I went to the police station, I felt like I'd just committed a crime. Like the way they treated me really was surprising. And what do you want this for, mate? You got to have a genuine reason. You can't just come in here and I was like, whoa, I'm just trying to find out, mate. I'm trying to do the right thing here. And it was really like I was trying to buy a license to be a criminal or something. And when I reflect on that, anyone who's got their firearms license now has worked pretty hard to get it. So presumably it means something to them. And why does it mean something to them? And by its very nature, that means the people that you're probably scared about find it very hard to get access to firearms legally through legal means. So
I think most of the people that you should be worried about don't bother with it. Robbie, I can imagine that Townsville, like every other place of size in Queensland and Australia, it's far easier to get a firearm illegally without a license than it is to get one legally. So the people who jump through the hoops, they're not the problem. In fact, statistically, if you look all across Australia, it's well under 5%. It's usually between 2 and 3% of any firearms-related violence is committed by licensed firearm owners. That means 97 to 98% is done by people who don't get a license and don't have a registered gun and do all that. And they're the same people who've always got them. They use the word criminal. That means they don't obey the law. It's people like you and I that go down to the police and we do all this stuff and we pay all the money, and by the time you've paid hundreds of dollars for a safety course and hundreds of dollars for a license and hundreds of dollars, if not thousands, for a safe, but you haven't even got a gun yet.
Yeah, that's right.
And I doubt you're going to do that so you can go hold up the local 7-Eleven.
And let's address some of these questions that people have. I mean, the first one that is usually led with is, well, guns kill people. Why do we need them in society? And they're a bad thing because they kill people. What's your reaction to when people say that to you?
Well, it's not true any more than saying that cars kill people or chainsaws or bobcats. Guns are just a machine, just a tool, and they don't do anything on their own. It's who's holding them. And you say, well, if they weren't around, it'd be less lives. Well, if they weren't around, police wouldn't be able to protect us as well. If they weren't around, we'd have an even bigger feral animal problem than we've got. If they weren't around, we wouldn't be able to, as landowners, be able to carry out the humane stock destruction we need to do, unfortunately, at times when animals injure themselves, because they're a very practical tool for that. If they weren't around, we wouldn't have the international sporting competitions we have. They're used for a multitude of things, and putting that in perspective, guns kill people. In Australia, there are more people that die from falling off chairs and tables every year in Australia than they do from firearms. It's simply so low, considering there is at least 3 million odd firearms in Australia. If there was a real problem, you'd know about it.
Sounds like we need to start locking up the chairs and tables. That sounds things.
It's a bit like that. Yeah.
Don't worry, I've had that sort of reaction to other issues I've brought up with the government before as well. Maybe we should be, We're laughing about that now.
And I say that and people don't believe it, but it's an actual thing. It's a very, very low number, and it's been a low number for an awfully long time.
Yeah. We're dispelling myths. What about, the other common one is the throwaway line with guns. Mate, what do you want us to end up like the US? What about that?
That's a very common line, Robbie. I get it a lot. You especially get it from uninformed journalists and things. And my comment is, Australia is not the US. We speak a similar language, a bit different, but we speak a similar language. That's about it. Culturally, we're very different. Australia didn't have gun laws until between the First and Second World Wars, essentially. And we still had a far lower violence rate than the US. It's a very different country historically, culturally, everything else. I would suggest that in the US, a lot of people own firearms in response to it being a violent society. And here, it's not as violent. And so regardless of the laws here, and I'm not saying you should have the same laws as there, I've never said that, It's a different culture, and different legal solutions work better in different cultures. But we're not going to end up like the US. If they brought in all these new gun laws in 1996, 97, and they said, oh, we took away all these guns. There is far more firearms, legally owned firearms in Australia today than there was in 1996 when they did that. So they took away that. There's probably 500,000 to 1 million more guns in Australia now than there was then. How come our crime rates continue to go down? A properly regulated or properly managed system of firearms ownership is incredibly safe, just as it is in all the Scandinavian countries,
Yep.
Throughout most of Europe. It's really saying you're going to become like that. Well, that's like saying we're going to become like Russia tomorrow, are we?
Yep.
That's silly.
It seems to be an attitude that comes out of Canberra bureaucrats and the likes who've never. This just seems such foreign language to them, and it's like activity that happens in a foreign land, and they just feel that everyone's inherently, you can't trust them because you don't know them, and they must be at some point intent on doing some bad deeds because you just can't trust them at all. That seems to be that attitude that drives it.
It really does, and it goes back to what you said about optics. The politician sitting there, or the staffer or the media person sitting there in the Canberra office or the Brisbane office, be it state or federal, and there's one of these weird killings or something in the United States, they immediately go, oh, that's here, that's this, that's that. And you go, wait a minute, it's a totally different situation, legally, culturally, historically, everything else, and yet because it's cheap media, as in the media, there's so many networks cover it in the States, it's easy for them to just take a feed and put it on the TV.
Yep.
However, the same thing happens in another country that doesn't speak English, Denmark or somewhere else, or Paris, France, where a guy takes a rental truck and kills 80 people. And no one says, oh, we should really ban rental trucks.
Yep.
You go, oh, that's stupid. And no one says Australia's the same. If we don't do something about rental trucks, we'll be the same as France, you know.
Yeah, that's right. And I've heard stories directly that have been conversation been having in Queensland before over many years that, you know, they do just they ban something just for the optics of it, with knowing that there's no evidence to back it up. Tell me a little bit about the licensing, because it's certainly my view that they put all this effort into chasing people like me. So the only people that lock up to the police station for their 5 or 10 year renewal, they jump through all the hoops. The evidence shows they're not the problem, but when there's a legislator in Brisbane, it's easy for them to say, well, we need this to look like we're tightening up gun laws. Let's just send extra letters to Rob Katter and make it a bit harder for him. Yeah. When all the criminal activity is sitting at the side happening with illegally acquired firearms, there's nothing in that activity or that effort does anything to enhance community safety around firearms. That's all coming from the unlawful use, but all the effort goes into the licensed firearm owners, which time and time again, the evidence just shows comprehensively there's just no value in it. And that's where 100% of the effort from government always seems to be in that space. Can you talk to us about that a bit?
Well, they refuse to look at evidence-based legislation. Evidence-based legislation, as you know, it's talked about a lot in politics, is really where you have laws and regulation that's based around evidence that's produced. Well, when it comes to firearms, they simply don't do that. They will just go on emotive, and we want a press release. And as you said, we want a press release that we're tough on guns. There was, someone shot someone, so we need a press release that we're tough on guns. Well, wouldn't you want to look at how you'd prevent that? And how you'd prevent it would have, in 97, 98% of cases, have zero to do with how you're going to manage legal gun owners. And people say, well, if there wasn't legal gun ownership, the criminals wouldn't get the guns. Yep. And that's another argument that people make. They'll say, and it sounds reasonably logical. You say, well, Robbie, if you didn't have that gun, they couldn't steal it off you and then use it. Okay, it sounds reasonable, except I was involved in a Senate inquiry into that about 8 years ago, federal Senate inquiry into that, and what it showed is the majority of illegal firearms are either imported, smuggled into the country, just like drugs are smuggled into this country. If there's money in it, if I can, the Glock pistols like the police use, if you have a license, you can buy something similar to that for $600-700.
Yep.
If you don't have a license, you want to buy one illegally, someone will get $7,000 to $10,000.
Right.
So you tell me why there isn't, if the same criminals can smuggle in marijuana or heroin or all these other things, do you think they're not going to smuggle in guns with that sort of margin? Yep. There was a post office in New South Wales. The licensed owners of the post office were caught with 300 handguns. Now, who knows how many other hundreds or thousands they imported?
Yep.
This is it's the reality, but the politicians don't want to look at that. They want to go, oh, it's this. Well, it's not that. The number of actual thefts is very, very low. We have very rigorous storage requirements, which mean firearms, for anyone who's not aware that's watching, firearms when they're not in use in a target range or in a farm or whatever, they are locked up in a safe. And so really, for the number of firearms out there, they're very small numbers are stolen, and it's less than 1% of all firearms that are stolen are ever recovered or involved in a known crime. And you go, wait a minute. So even the ones that do get stolen, most of the time, they end up getting thrown in the creek because they're too big and they don't know what to do with them. Or they sell it to Joe who, puts it in his attic or something like that. Yep. And he shouldn't do it and everything else, but he's also not out causing mayhem with it.
Yep.
So the illegal importation, the illegal manufacture of firearms are two big sources of it, and you simply can't stop that. And countries like England that totally banned the ownership of handguns, not rifles or shotguns, they're similar to us with those, but with handguns, they totally banned it about 20 years ago. Their handgun crime rate went up, and it's continued to go up.
That's a really important point, Graham. That's a really important point for real, because I've been told that before, but because
it's true. It's
if you follow through the logic here in Australia, banning is the ultimate thing to do, banning guns.
Yeah.
Well, the reverse happened in England. As you said, and I'd heard that before, that gun crimes are... So why are we putting this effort into licensed firearm owners? We should be agreeing with the anti-gun people, I imagine. If we're all about community safety, we should have a lot of common ground with the anti-firearm people, because there's so much to talk about in efforts to make us safer, but the trouble is that it's all concentrated on the licensed firearm owners and therefore wasted, all that police effort.
When I'm in meetings, and sometimes you end up in meetings where there are some of the anti-gun people, and you end up, say, after a meeting, between meeting settings, you're sitting outside having a coffee or something, right. And some of them don't want to talk to us, but some of them you're chatting to just like this privately. We actually agree with a lot. Legal firearm owners, be they farmers, target shooters, collectors, whatever they are, have more to lose with bad gun regulation and management than anyone else, because if someone does go nuts, guess who they're going to pick on is us. So one question that always comes up is, but the gun crime rate in Australia has dropped so much since, or the gun homicide rate's dropped so much since 96 when they brought in those laws. Well, that's true, but it was dropping for 7 years before that.
Wow.
And it hasn't dropped at a greater rate. It was dropping since the late 80s. And it was dropping here, it was dropping in Canada, it was dropping in the United States, it was dropping in New Zealand, it was dropping in the United Kingdom, Germany, Switzerland. I don't know the reason why, but all those countries had different regulatory environments. and some have gotten stricter and some have gotten less strict over the years, but all saw that same drop. And many people, researchers will say it's got to do with demographics and aging populations more than anything else. But the fact is, it made no difference here. And every objective researcher who's looked at it has said, yes, the deaths went down due to firearms. However, they were going down at exactly the same rate before, and there's no quantifiable difference in the rate. And that's not just shooters unions making this stuff up. This is researchers who were not particularly interested one way or the other. They were just looking at the numbers, and in some cases they were quite wanting it to be that it worked so they could bring it in their country. Yeah. And then when they've looked at it, they've said, well, what's the point?
Mate, I've heard some, you've told me a lot of stories over the years, some bizarre sort of, whether you call them anomalies or just circumstances where the laws apply and, like this is banned, that isn't. You can keep 20 guns in that safe, but next door your wife can't have the same amount or, there's just all these funny consequences of the laws that are there that really make it a farce of how they they operate and, I guess, reinforce that notion that this is all about optics for the public, not really about real. Could you give us a few examples of some of those sort of silly situations you're in?
It's really true, and I always say to people, if they look for common sense, don't look at gun laws, because of that optics thing, and it's a confused mishmash. You could streamline the whole process, save governments around Australia tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and have better public safety outcomes.
Yep, I agree.
And less red tape if you wanted to, but that's not the intent. So some examples would be you can own if you're in a pistol club, you can own what they call a Ruger Charger, which is a type of .22 pistol. And it's quite a large one, but you can have it and use it in competition and do that.
Yeah.
That same firearm is available with a longer barrel and a stock as a .22 rifle.
Yeah.
Illegal.
Illegal, yeah.
Now, it's illegal, and yet it's the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's harder for a criminal to conceal.
Yes, yes.
I mean, think about it. A criminal, I don't think you've got to be a criminologist to understand that a criminal wants something this big, not something 1.5 meters long.
Yep. I find it funny that if I lived out in Boulia, I was a grazer at Boulia, which is about 1,000 kilometres from Townsville, nearest large metropolitan area, but if I've got more chance of getting a pistol if I go and drive to Townsville and discharge it in the middle of Townsville at a pistol club than I have owning it as a primary producer.
Correct.
Right out in the middle of nowhere. So you're more likely to be able to legally use it in a metropolitan area as a pistol club than out on a remote station where no one else exists.
Part of the gun laws is a genuine need. And with that particular point, they'll say, why does a primary producer need a handgun? Well, there's innumerable reasons, which is why they've always had them and why it's allowed under the law. But about 6 or 7 years ago, as you found out and some of your constituents, a lot of legitimate landholders who use these as a tool of trade their licenses were being rejected, denied, new licenses weren't being granted. I've seen people have to submit up to 40 pages of documents to get one. And also the fee is 2.5 times the fee than it is for someone who goes to a pistol club. It's ridiculous. And the pistol club's very rigorous. It's hard to get one for that. But you go to the next step, which, as you say, is probably far less risk overall considering where they're located. And the usage of it they need for animal welfare and other issues. It's like, wait a minute, it's a whole double standard. And you've got things in the law that says, and this will probably boggle a few people's mind, if I have a license that says I can use this particular gun, whatever type it is, for hunting, well, then I can't use it necessarily for target,
Yeah.
or
Right.
I'd have to buy another gun for that.
Yeah.
Especially with handguns. I know a gentleman in Toowoomba. He's a security guard, and he has 3 of the exact same Glock pistol.
Right.
Why does he have 3? One is on his pistol club license, so he can practice, so he can be competent and safe. But it would be illegal for him to carry that at work. So one is on his work license as a security guard, but it'd be illegal for him to use at the pistol club.
Yeah.
And one, he's an instructor who teaches other people, and that would be illegal to either use at the pistol club or at work. They're exactly the same gun. The only difference is the serial number. So the law is actually forcing him to have 3 times as many guns. So if you're worried about gun theft, why wouldn't you just say he's got a license, he can use it for any lawful purpose, such as his work or his sport or training? Why would you want him to buy 3?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So, Graham, explain us that, weapons licensing branch are probably where the rubber hits the road. If I go and apply for a gun licence and they assess it, and I guess all the society used to be more accustomed. You go out to a cousin's place on a farm where there was a 22 and people don't do that as much anymore, or a lot of people, even in the rural or regional towns, used to have a 22 for the snakes or whatever, and around the house. That doesn't happen much anymore, and progressively less people are sort of unfamiliar with, licensed firearm ownership. But QPS with the weapons licensing sort of, well, I would hold the view, unfortunately, have people there that don't really have a background in it, and that can be a problem when making assessments as well, because they don't know. So if the rural producer, that it's a mum whose husband has to drive trucks to keep the place going, and he's away most of the time, she has to go and check on the watering points, which are often turkeys' nets, which is a lot of grass and shrubs around with pigs. She's with the kids in the car, and if she's got to crawl through the fence 5 or 10 times a day checking the waters, she's not going to take a rifle because it's bulky and gets in the road, but you'll put a handgun or a pistol there. But she goes to apply for a pistol licence, the primary tutor, that's not a valid use, and then someone at QPS who just has no experience with any of this stuff is the one making judgment calls on this. Is that how you see it?
It's very difficult, and you're very right. Look, as a whole, QPS, Queensland Police Service, as a whole, the officers on the ground around the state, especially in regional areas where they're very familiar with people, legitimate firearm owners, are really good. They're pretty practical about the whole thing. However, the actual management of licensing and everything else is handled by a separate branch called Weapons Licensing Branch. And there's currently about 80 odd people work in there, of which 70 odd are civilians. There seems to be the very few of those understand much about firearms or the use or why they'd be used or anything else, which hits on what you say. And I think it makes it more difficult for them. And I think it makes it more difficult for the legitimate firearms owner or wannabe owner, because they're saying this and that, and you're talking to someone or filling out paperwork for someone who really has no concept of that. As an example, weapons licensing has a major backlog at the moment of licenses and things, and those of you watching who've either got a renewal or a new license in know it's taking an awfully long time, 6 months or so to get a new license. And renewals are slow, and permit to acquire, which is for a gun, are slow. So they've got a big backlog. So they've been given, I think, $1.6 million by the state government to clear the backlog. Yep. So they're hiring somewhere around 40 temporary staff. They're going to hire them for 6 to 8 months. Now, they're not hiring people with any background in firearms. In fact, anecdotal evidence suggests that if you say you have a background in that, they don't want to hire you.
Yeah, right.
Maybe they feel, oh, you'd be too sympathetic to it. Well,
Mm.
the law's the law. All you got to do is work within that framework. But I think it's a real pity that there aren't more people with a knowledge and understanding of working in there. When there was a higher percentage of police officers in there, especially older as above, say, 40 up, they'd had experience out there. Most of them had worked in regional areas and stuff, and they knew the licensed people weren't the issue. They also knew what people do with them, why they do this, why they do that. And some things that are completely obvious to you are not completely obvious to someone from inner suburban Brisbane whose only experience with a gun is they watched a shoot 'em up movie.
Yep.
They watched John Wick.
Yep. That, Hollywood's got a lot to answer for license
Oh, they
firearms.
really do. It's a fantasy land stuff, and hey, it's entertaining, but it's got no basis in reality. As an instructor, I take people out, and they're horrified that they can't hit the target, and I go, it actually takes skill and practice, because they think they're going to pick it up like in the movies,
Yeah.
and shoot a grapefruit at 1,000 yards or something.
I know I'm a testimony to the fact that it takes a lot of practice, because anything outside a 50-foot radius, any pig outside a 50-foot radius of me and my 30-30 is pretty lucky
Pretty
pig.
safe.
Yeah.
So the vegans watching this can feel good, because if Robbie's chasing the pigs, they're fairly safe.
Yeah. But people worried about foot and mouth disease should be worried, because we're not getting rid of the pigs. I mean, there's so many practical functions people take for granted that shooters do for free for the country.
Yes.
And biosecurity, control of kangaroos, feral pigs, feral dogs. There's boarding shooters around and licensed firearms. There's hunters all around Queensland, Australia. I'm included. One of them, I go out, shoot pigs, and thanks very much. You can give me a pat on the back because I'm helping. I think they say if you don't destroy 75 to 80% of the pig population every day, it will continue to expand, and it's one of our biggest biosecurity risks.
And this is a real problem. Since '96, before '96 it was common for country people to have a firearm in a vehicle, they would see targets of opportunity.
Yeah.
When they were out just going around doing things, and they'd shoot pigs or dingoes and stuff like that, and it helped keep it down. We now have a situation where this is not counting kangaroos, just looking at feral damage is well over, so many 100 million a year in damage to agriculture, not to the environment, just to agriculture.
Yeah.
And you stop and you think, it's risen dramatically because it's not as common to be taking care of them because, the gun's back in the safe. It's not with them.
Yep.
And so the whole feral animal thing is a major issue, and it's about to get a lot bigger if God forbid, something happens with foot and mouth.
Yep.
We really want as many people out there as we can, and it generates a lot of income in rural areas. I mean, New South Wales, I think it was, did a survey of the revenue from people out chasing pigs and stuff and hunting deer or doing all the different activities that went to the bush. And it was somewhere close to $300 million a year. And I believe that was just in New South Wales. It was an enormous amount of money because it's not just buying the guns, buying the ammunition. You've got the fuel to drive out there.
Yep.
You've got the vehicle, the four-wheel drive.
Yep.
You've got the tents. You've got accommodation at the local motel. You've got the slab of beer. You've got the food. You've got all these things that you buy, and the money gets spent and goes directly into regional communities.
Yep.
And it's kind of like no one cares about that, and yet it's a major economic benefit. It seriously is. And how many people in that Townsville, Charters, Towers sort of basin there, how many people go out, 2 or 3 times a year and chase some pigs and stuff to another community, and they spend money, and it spreads it around. How many guys at that army base in Townsville, that's a recreation for them? How many blokes up in the Gulf, that's a recreation? How many of these tiny little towns, the Clay Target Club is one of the major social hubs in the community. And you go there in the local business zone, and local people are there mixing, and doing stuff in the community. Community activities are really important, and on the sporting side that's there, but also on the feral management side, no one can afford to hire, well, not no one, most primary producers cannot afford to hire professional pest controllers and pay them a lot of money.
Yeah.
So we need volunteers.
And you know, when you say that, the volunteers that you get to go and do a lot of this shooting, at recreational shooting, pest control, like if you've gone to the effort to get your license and get on a place, and there's a lot in that, it generally means you're a pretty organised and functional person in society that's pretty responsible to, you know, the sort of person you'd send into town with your wallet to get you something, because they're, you know, trustworthy if you go through all the hoops to get to that point.
I'll give you an example. 3 people that come out and help on our property. One, former Army rifle and marksmanship trainer of 20-some years before he retired. Be one of the most qualified people in the country. Then he ran a ATM business that went and picked up the cash from ATMs and stuff. Hugely responsible guy. Yeah. It's great because he tells me, oh, this pipe's broken or that. Very responsible guy. Another one runs a large IT business in Brisbane. Very responsible guy. Another guy owns a chain of 8 hairdressing salons.
Yeah.
These are pretty responsible people.
Yeah.
Another's a former member of parliament. I mean, I don't have a problem with them being out here. They're not out shooting up the fences and killing my cattle or anything else. I mean, most landowners, we're responsible enough to know who I want on the place and who I don't. I mean, really, and I won't let a tip for any primary producers watching is, if you have people come on your property to shoot, do yourself a favour from a liability point of view and don't let them come on to shoot unless they've got liability insurance. If they're a member of Shooters Union or, say, Sporting Shooters Association, they will have $20 million worth of liability. That means if they shoot your bull, you'll get covered. If they shoot a hole in the shed, you're covered.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that I would personally won't let anyone on the place to shoot unless they have that liability insurance. I just say, are you a member of Shooters Union or Sporting Shooters, one of those type of organisations? They say, yep. I say, great, because I know that they're part of that community, and I also know they got insurance.
Good to know. Hey, mate, give us a, you know, like one of the things like where your advocacy sort of helped was with the COVID, you know, just talking about that prejudice that exists against the industry. Explain to us what happened to shutting down the gun shops in COVID, because they didn't shut anything else down. They didn't shut down sporting stores, but they shut down. Well, inadvertently they shut down sporting stores. But you tell us what happened there.
So, for some reason, as soon as COVID hit and they started making these health orders, they decided to make an exception. And whilst Dan Murphy's and other places all stayed open, gun shops had to shut. And realistically, the reasoning, they wouldn't admit it, but the reasoning was they were terrified people were going to run out and buy stuff, you know, to
because we're all crazies that own guns. We're all crazies.
And we said, wait a minute, it takes you 6 months to get a license. So it'd all be over and done with before you got that handled. And we went to, I mean, it was crazy because it just shut businesses like this. And as you know, in a lot of rural communities, it shut businesses that also did other things. Because some businesses in rural towns, they do guns and ammo, but they're a hardware store and they're everything else. And so that shut them down. And so we were screaming, and I know thanks to you and Nick DeMetto and Shane, you guys all got on side, and a few regional politicians down south, and just said to the ag minister and the police minister, we've got to fix this. And it was even stopping on the Monday morning, Queensland police couldn't get supplies from one of the the big
Yep.
importers, and they said, we can't supply it to you right now. And they went, what do you mean? And so even there were I know of a police inspector who was screaming about it because
Yep.
he couldn't get his department supplies. And eventually, over a period of a week or so, they relented, but they relented in such a way that, oh, if you were a primary producer, you could get it. Well, if you didn't have a certain code on your license, and understand there's about 68 different codes, and if you didn't have one of two or three, you couldn't work it. So you had a lot of primary producers that still couldn't get it, and they were going crazy. And it took us, another 2 weeks to do it. But we did get it sorted out finally, and it was a major issue. It really hurt economically a lot of small businesses, and it hurt a lot of primary producers who needed ammunition in particular, or they might have had a broken gun and needed another one to replace it for cropping or anything else.
Yeah.
And that's a classic example of that discrimination. That wasn't done against anyone else,
Yeah.
just us. Why? We're the most, it's a highly regulated environment. Gun stores can't sell guns or ammunition to anyone that doesn't already have a license, which they spent months and hundreds, if not thousands of dollars getting.
Yep. Yeah, it was that was a clear example there of just where that complete bias kicks in. Let's make a statement, and the inadvertent and you had big stockpiling of ammunition then too, didn't you? And stores that were closed in towns, all places like that. The massive stock. If you wanted a security risk or a public safety risk, store a big heap of ammunition in an unsupervised shop that could go broke in the next month. Try dealing with that. See how you go, police or government.
Exactly. Normally those shops have people in them every day, and there wasn't for a period of time. It's only really, it's very fortunate, even with the security, that thankfully criminals didn't sort of realize it at the time. But you're right. I mean, there was a lot of build-up, orders were coming in, everything else. So, yes, it was a silly thing, all caused by discrimination because bureaucrats in power went, if people are stuck at home on these lockdowns, domestic violence will go through the roof and they'll be shooting each other.
Yes.
Well, it didn't happen. Of course it didn't happen. It was never going to happen. There's no evidence that it even happened anywhere else.
It's, just to draw to a bit of a close, Graham, it's just that it is, like I said at the start, just seems to be one of those issues that's shrouded in the greatest level of ignorance, which is probably stands to reason because most people have nothing to do with guns in the city, and most of those people in Canberra around government don't have anything to do with it. So they just assume the worst and legislate accordingly. And I would argue that the unintended consequences of legislation actually makes things worse rather than. It certainly doesn't help. It certainly doesn't make things better. And everyone, as you pointed out earlier, everyone points to, Johnny Howard's gun law has really improved the things. Like you said, it was improving before that. Most of it's irrelevant.
I don't see how a law that you enact could have improved it 7 years or 8 years before the law was enacted. And it just doesn't do it. But the media has pushed a certain line, and it also naturally fits the political parties' lines that, hey, look at us, we're doing something.
Yeah.
We only got to look at the last couple of years with COVID to see certain things were done that made sense. Other things were done that you'd look at and scratch your head at stupidity, like drive around the car on your own with a mask on. I mean, really? So something in the gun realm, much of it's done on emotion.
Yeah.
Much of it's done for a press release because they can't differentiate between stuff, say, in the US and here. So let's get a press release out. We're doing something. But a lot of it's emotive. And people, as you said at the start of this conversation, guns are bad, should get rid of them. Well, no, you could make the same argument for motor vehicles and many other things. Perhaps they're items that are potentially dangerous. Therefore, we need to manage them and have some regulation surrounding them. However, evidence shows they can be properly managed. We have a very large alcohol industry. A lot of people die with alcohol-related things, but it's an industry that's managed.
Yep.
We have a large number of motor vehicles. Tens of times more people die in motor vehicle accidents. but we manage that. And what we suggest is use evidence-based management, and you could get a better public safety outcome with less cost to the taxpayer.
Yep.
It's cost billions of dollars, these gun laws, for virtually no result other than to harass farmers and collectors and target shoot. I mean, yeah, really, it's why would you bother? A former police minister of Queensland who had been a police officer prior to going in politics said when he was a senior sergeant running a station in a regional area, he said, the one group of people in the town you didn't have to worry about was the blokes with the gun licenses because they don't want to lose them so they don't do anything wrong.
Yeah, good point. But the big loser at the end of the day is the public because
it really is
about guns. They're losing. There's no enhancement of public safety, and we could be addressing gun safety or if they focused in the right areas, but they don't.
There are things we could be doing to improve the public safety if we can all work together with sensible ideas. Some people have the idea, shooters union, you blokes just want to get out there and hand out machine guns on the corner to 8-year-olds.
That's what they think. Yeah.
I know that, and I get that, when people say, get me on the ABC and they get this and they want debates. And it's like, really? Is that what we want? No, what we want is an effectively managed system that works for both the user groups and the general public. I can understand why the general public is concerned. They're fed all this nonsense from Hollywood movies and stuff from other cultures that are nothing like ours. And they're not fed some facts. And the facts, to be honest, are fairly boring. It's not that exciting. So it's kind of like they don't want to know about them. What they want is the safety outcome. They want to know that you're not handing out guns to people who shouldn't have them. And we're in total agreement on that. We're big. The reason you said about at the start, I'm an instructor with all this, is because I supervise a lot of instructors and work with instructors because we believe that proper safety training is critical. And I think there's a really good record out there of firearm safety. There's extremely few people accidentally injured by firearms. And there's extremely few people that are deliberately harmed by firearms. So we're doing a job, but a better job could be done for a lot less money. We're in a digital age. It's actually become cheaper to manage these things and faster and more efficient ways than are currently done. I won't bore people with the detail, but if they think about other aspects of their life, there's simpler, quicker, cheaper ways to do stuff that are more effective and will ensure that firearms don't get into the wrong hands.
Graham, I think you've done a pretty good job of cutting the horns off your head that everyone thinks you get.
I'll glue them back on later.
Yeah. No, it's appreciate your time, mate. It's very rare that people get to listen to the sense of reason and the other side of the argument. But I appreciate the job you do, mate, and thanks for your time here today.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to you guys for representing regional Queensland in the way that you do, because I think it puts a little bit of common sense back into politics.
All the best, mate.
Thank you. Have a good one.